It is my pleasure and honor to recognize Sarah for sharing her story and bringing it back to Stamford, which was her home for so many years. Jews have always been mobile, and now as our society is even more mobile and we often move, as Sarah has done, to be near family, it is more important than ever that we share our common heritage and history. We are recognizing Sarah with this gift and also, this is for you, and we're also making a donation to the United States Memorial Holocaust Museum in honor of you coming to speak with us. We also want to remember your husband Joseph, who was a leader of the JHS and responsible for our having a Holocaust book collection, which is part of our library and archives. This is a continuing legacy to our community from a couple who are longtime members of JHS. We're so grateful for your visit and for your presentation. Thank you so much.
Just a few commercial, Joyce, if you would join us up here as well. I just have a few commercial announcements before we actually get started. On Wednesday, November 20th, we are having our book talk, Road to Valor, a true story of World War II, Italy, the Nazis, and the cyclists who inspired a nation by Ali and Andres McConnell. Frank Meltzer will be facilitating this book talk, and it's not here at the JCC, it's at Atria, and it's going to be at 10 in the morning. So that's Wednesday, November 20th. And I hope you'll all join us. If there's anybody here who likes to drink, well, I know I do. We're actually having Dr. Glenn Diner, who's coming to talk about his new book, L'Chaim, Yankel's Tavern, Jews, Liquor, and Life in the Kingdom of Poland. And this is going to be at Congregation Agudath Shalom on Sunday, December 8th at 10:30. That's just about a month from today. So it'll be after Hanukkah, but we can still celebrate. So, other commercial announcements. I'd like to ask you to turn off any cell phones you have or anything electronic with you except your pacemakers. And one other thing as the junction, as we're about to hear this amazing story, but this is the junction of Kristallnacht and Veterans Day, I'd like for you to stand up if you're a Holocaust survivor and you're present here today. I'd like for you to stand up if you're a member of a family of a Holocaust survivor. I'd like for you to stand up if you have served in the American military at any time. These are our veterans, and the ones who were in World War II are also our survivors. So let's give a big hand for all of them. And now on to our main event. Our speaker today is Sarah Lou Miller, the author of Hiding in Plain Sight, Eluding the Nazis in Occupied France. And this book is authored by Joyce B. Lazarus. The two, co-author. Okay, I'm going to get it right. We in Stanford welcome you, and we claim you, Sarah Lou Miller, as one of our own. And this is the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of Kristallnacht, as was mentioned. This is an unusual memoir about a childhood and young adulthood of Miss Miller. She was born to a large Orthodox Jewish family in Dresden, Poland, and her family moved to Paris in 1937 to escape poverty. After the Nazis occupied France, with the help of Christian neighbors, the family evaded arrest in Paris for several years by living undercover. Miss Miller escaped to Switzerland to be reunited with her family after the war. And this memoir demonstrates the qualities of resilience and courage that enabled individuals and families, such as Sarah Lou Miller's, to survive. And after many years, Sarah Lou Miller found her way to Stanford, where she and her husband Joe Miller were very active, as you've heard, in the Stanford Jewish community. The co-author of this book, Joyce B. Lazarus, grew up in New York City, earned a PhD in French from Harvard University. She is Professor Emerita in Modern Languages at Framingham State University, where she taught for 39 years, starting as a child, of course. She has written extensively on French and Jewish cultural matters. So it is my very great pleasure to introduce these two women, Sarah Lou Miller and Joyce B. Lazarus. It's all yours.
First of all, I want to greet you all as a remembrance from me to you. Hello to all of you. I'm so excited to be back in my hometown where my children grow up. In Stamford, Joe and I felt at home, surrounded by a vibrant Jewish community and good friends. Joe spent many years working happily at Grand Central Markets with the Lazarus family. Me, typically a woman, I worked at several places. I started off working at the Stanford Day Nursery, where my little boy Gabriel stayed with me until he was ready to go to elementary school. I then worked at the country club of Darien, a nice place. And lastly, until retirement, I worked at the American Red Cross. The Jewish Community Center is where I love to come swimming, exercise, visit the library, and meet my senior friends for lunch. One day, I heard that the senior creative writing class was taking place at the center. I just gave a look, stayed, and then came regularly. One day, our teacher, Brenda Smith, who couldn't come today, told us at Stanford a general competition for non-professional writers of all ages would take place. She insisted that we all write something. Weeks later, our teacher announced that our class and I, Sarah Miller, had won first prize for a non-fiction story, Oh Beautiful Switzerland, How I Remember Thee. I must admit that my whole being was pleased with this announcement. The $50 gift I received went happily as a donation to JCC. The sadness I'd been feeling about missing being a violinist virtuoso went away. I realized that I could do other things in life that can please me as well. 4 years later, in 1996, another competition took place in Stamford. This time, I won second prize with my non-fiction story, Remembrance. I left Stanford as a widow in December 2002. I moved to Canton, Massachusetts, where I live comfortably at Hebrew Senior Life, Orchard Cove, where all my needs are met. My son Gabriel lives close by in Waben, Massachusetts. My daughter Rebecca lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And now my co-writer, Joyce Lazarus, will tell you how fate brought us together.
Good afternoon. Hope you don't mind if I'm standing, because I'm used to standing when I speak. But I'm very glad to be here. I wanted to tell you how Sarah and I met each other. It was kind of an interesting story. We met each other at the senior residence where Sarah lives in Canton, Massachusetts, through some cousins of mine who lived at the same residence. I had previously published a book about France during World War II, and I gave it to my cousins, and I wrote a dedication to them, and they read it, and then when they were finished, they gave it to the library at the residence, and Sarah took out the book from the library, and I guess she was interested because it was related a little bit to her own life experiences. And after she read it, she saw the dedication to my cousins, and she spoke to my cousin and said she wanted to ask me some questions about it. So my cousin put us in touch with each other, and we started to correspond by email. And then the emails began to grow and grow and grow because she sent me some stories about her childhood. She told me about her childhood in France, and she sent me some stories that she had written at Stamford, Connecticut. And I thought that this was an important story to tell, the story of her childhood and young adulthood. Because here was a family, a large family of Orthodox Jews who were Polish refugees who had settled in France before World War II broke out, and they were unable to leave France when the Nazis came in. And the remarkable thing about this family is that all 10 members of her immediate family survived 4 years of German occupation in France. And so I had a lot of questions to ask her. I wanted to know about what daily life was like for her and for her family. And she told me about some of the dangers and the hardships that her family faced on a daily basis. And these are things that are very difficult for many of us to even imagine. For example, her mother needed to go out shopping to get groceries, but she didn't speak very much French. She spoke Yiddish. And if anybody overheard her accent, they could have reported her, and the Nazis were offering large monetary rewards for anybody who could round up a Jew, report the Jews. So every day that her mother went out to the grocery stores, she had to somehow conceal her Yiddish accent. This was very difficult. Food was very, very scarce to begin with. For anybody, food was so scarce. If her parents stayed in their apartment, they would all starve. So they had to go out. And when they went out on the street, they were mingling with German soldiers who were on the lookout for Jews. And they needed to have, if they were stopped by a Nazi, they had to show their identification card. But Sarah's parents did not have identification cards that they could show because they had the word Jew stamped on their identification cards. Every moment of the day had new dangers and new hardships for them. And this was the story that became our book, Hiding in Plain Sight, the story of a family's survival under very difficult circumstances. The title refers to the fact that they needed to be invisible. They couldn't betray their real identity. They had to somehow blend in with the population and have a double identity for 4 years of the war. And her story began in Poland, in a shtetl, which is now part of the Ukraine, a shtetl called Derechin, something like that. Did I pronounce it pretty good? Yes. And many people have a romanticized view of what shtetl life was like, partly from literature or from Hollywood, but the reality was very, very different. Life in the shtetl was very, very hard. Sarah's father left when Sarah was 5 years old to come to France to find employment. And so Sarah's mother was left with 7 children at that time, trying to support them on a very low income. And conditions were very hard. There was a risk, first of all, a risk of fires, because the little buildings were wood, and they were very close to each other, so fires often broke out. There was no electricity, no plumbing. They had a wood-burning stove, but it made the air suffocating in the winter. It was hard to breathe in the house. There were racist attacks. They often had to, the police would come and raid their house and steal things from them. The police were very corrupt. As an example of how difficult life was, Sarah had a brother who was about 2 years old, and he became very ill, but her mother couldn't afford to go to a doctor. They had very little money. So there was no medicine, no treatment if you got ill. Her brother stopped breathing, and her mother screamed, and a neighbor came in and saw the child was lifeless and just brought the child outside and shook the child in the cold air, and miraculously the child started to cough and to breathe again. And his life was saved in that way. And this was life in the shtetl. Let's continue, and Sarah will tell you a little bit more about her family. This was about her train journey, which is, yes, okay. Yes. Okay.
In Dorechin, our hometown, we were very poor. Papa, all his life a student, was no businessman. He was a graduated rabbi from a very famous yeshiva, but there was no need for a new rabbi in our village. So in order to survive, he left Dorechin for Europe to find a steady job. He settled in Paris, working in a food store as a kosher chicken slaughterer. 5 years later, we were on our way by train to be reunited as a family. I'm going to read you a few parts of chapter 2, A Train Journey. As we approached the German border, the train lurched and screeched to a halt. Then suddenly 2 uniformed Germans entered our train car. Their black gloves and boots shining. I could see the metallic gleam of guns attached to their belts. Passports, tickets, identification paper. Mama reached into her bag and tried to show no emotion. As she handed them to the officer, the Germans glanced at our documents and then back at Mama. These are not valid papers. You cannot continue on this trip through Germany. Leave the train now. Not comprehending or perhaps not wanting to listen, Mama did not move. In broken Polish, one of the Germans repeated his orders more loudly. In a barking voice, documents, worthless, off the main train immediately. Go back to Poland. The 8 of us scrambled to collect our possession and to stop out on the train platform. Claire and I, Madeleine, began to cry. Bernard and Jacques gazed blankly at me. Mama all at once collected her wits. She confronted head-on the German policeman standing in the train station. We are not going back to Poland. We must go on to France. We must continue. I would rather throw myself under the train with all my children than go back. The police officer stared at her with indifference, not bothering to reply. Would this be the end? Would the police arrest us? I didn't dare breathe. I kept my gaze on the stone platform. A nun, wearing a dark habit, suddenly appeared on the platform and walked up to Mama. I could not understand the words but caught the soothing tone of her voice as she whispered something to her. She spoke rapidly at the German officer and motioned to all of us to come with her. Whatever she said to the officer had persuaded him to let us leave with her. We followed followed her down deserted streets, covering our faces as best as we could against the icy wind. It wasn't until we were safely settled at our coats, on our coats for the night that we could breathe more freely. We realized that how much we had to be grateful for. This nun, who was a complete stranger to us, had just rescued us, a family of 8 Jews with barely any money or food, from the German authorities. We thanked them profusely and thank God for our narrow escape. Early next morning, our nun greeted us smiling with dark pumpernickel bread, creamy butter and hot tea. After breakfast, she told us that she knew a Jewish man living nearby who might be able to help us. Mama and the nun went off to find him. Mama told us later that it had taken a lot of persuasion from the nun before the old man agreed to open his door to them. Jews in Germany lived in isolation and terror of Hitler never knowing when the next knock on the door would be the Gestapo. Our guardian angel had persuaded him to write to the immigration authorities in Warsaw to mail us the missing legal document. Sure enough, about 10 days later, the legal paper arrived, and we asked our dear nun, thanking her for her kindness and help. On January 3, 1937, our train arrived in Paris, and we were reunited with Papa, a man I hardly knew. Paris meant, above all, safety and a chance for a new life. Thank you.
I will tell you the story, yes. In 1940, Germany conquered France, and the occupation began. And Sarah was 13 years old at the time. Immediately, there were anti-Jewish laws that were put into place. And nothing really made any sense to Sarah at that time. The violence made no sense to her. The persecution made no sense at all. But the occupation hit home when her father could no longer work. He worked as a kosher butcher slaughterer. And one day, Sarah came to the store and discovered that her father could no longer work at the store. Yes, sure. Yes.
Papa could no longer work at the kosher store where he had been a ritual slaughterer. It all happened so unexpectedly one warm late spring day in 1941, when I stopped by after school to meet him. Instead of being greeted by the friendly store owner who knew me by name and who used to ask me how school was going, I saw instead his young wife, now a widow, dressed completely in black, managing the store while her 2 small girls sat silently on the floor. Papa told me that the store owner had been killed by Germans, shot in reprisal for a German killed by a French resistant. Papa told me to come home quickly with him. His face was ashen and he spoke in a deep, almost broken voice I could not recognize. He said he could no longer work there. His job has been eliminated. How could this be true? I wondered. Cruelty and violence made no sense at all to me. Maybe the store owner had been taken away to a labor camp or to prison, and he would return at the end of the war. Perhaps it had been a case of mistaken identity. I imagine that the store owner was still alive somewhere hiding. Things were happening much too quickly for me to understand.
So Sarah's parents responded differently to the occupation. Sarah's father was a rabbi, and he prayed very, very hard, and he retreated to his prayer books when these horrible things were happening. But it was Sarah's mother who was very active, and she was constantly trying to figure out how to save their children and their family. There were 8 children that they had to find a way of saving. She was always thinking about where they could hide. She was trying to find Christian families who could hide her family, her children. But it would take time. It would take a little time to do this. And one thing was that worked out in her favor, her family's favor, was that her 2 oldest sisters worked in clothing factories run by the Germans, and because clothing was so essential to the Germans for their war, they gave the Jews who worked in these factories a pass that prevented them from being deported right away, at least for a few years. And because of that, the family had an income, and they were able to pay, eventually they were able to pay some Christian families to hide the children for a while. And her 2 older brothers found employment on a farm, on different farms. They became farm laborers. And the younger children were hidden by Christian families. So at the beginning of the occupation, Sarah's mother arranged for Sarah to go live with Sarah's older sister, Hélène, in a small town in Burgundy, which was safer than Paris because the German police were not all over the place. There were only a few German police there. So Sarah went to live there in the spring of 1941. And I will read you a little part about what happened. So one day, Hélène told me to take Max, that's her baby brother who was about 2 or 2.5 years old at the time. He was still, to take him for a walk in his stroller along the riverbank. It was a mild, sunny morning with a hint of spring in the air. I followed a walkway next to the peaceful Loire River, and Max made happy noises as he pointed to ducks in the river. After a while, I sat down on a bench, and Max smiled contentedly next to me in his stroller. I told him to watch the ducks, and I began to read a book I had brought along, a wonderful novel. The book transported me to a world where there was no German occupation, and no roundup of Jews. The tranquility of the setting and the magic of fiction began to lull me. I felt at last relaxed and safe. Well, that was a big mistake, to take out a book and to lose track of her baby brother. She completely forgot about her baby brother in the stroller for a few minutes. I looked up from the novel, and the stroller was parked next to me, but Max was gone. Had I lost my mind? My fascination with reading had destroyed all my common sense. Max! Max! I screamed. I ran. I called Max's name everywhere. Panic overcame me. I sobbed uncontrollably. My baby brother Max was nowhere to be found, and I was completely to blame. I would never forgive myself. Not only was there a river nearby where he might have drowned, but there were train tracks not far away. There was nothing I could do but to run back to Hélène's house. Max! Max! Where are you? Sarah's sister Hélène stared at her. She just couldn't believe that Sarah had not been watching the baby when they were there. Now they had to go to the police. They had to report the baby's disappearance to the police. And now they could be deported. This was their worst nightmare, to have to go to the police. But it was very fortunate that this particular policeman knew the family, because Max's older sister had been living in this small town. It wasn't Paris. It was a small town where people knew each other, and they knew her sister and brother-in-law, and they were not trying to deport them. They were human. The policeman was actually human. And when they went to the police, I won't read you the whole story, but he said, "We found your baby brother. Somebody saw him wandering around by the train tracks and brought him in, and everything is going to be okay." And it was the policeman's silence that was so wonderful. He never once said, "We know you're Jewish." But he obviously did know they were Jewish, and he was protecting them by saying nothing. He just said, all he said was, "Everything is going to be fine. We found your baby brother." And that's how that story ended. So, after that, in July of 1942, Sarah's mother was arrested. This was a very notorious day. Many people have written about this roundup of Jews. It was called Vel d'Hiver, and this episode was made into a movie, Sarah's Key. It was the largest roundup of Jews in Paris, and there were 13,000 Jews rounded up. 10,000 of them were women and children. This was because the men everybody had been warned. Some Jews had heard that there was going to be a roundup, and so the men escaped, but they assumed that nobody would ever arrest women or children. They had no idea that the Germans and the French would be this barbaric, but they did, and Sarah's mother was arrested. But Sarah's oldest sister, Paulette, was a very brave woman. She went every single day to the camp, and she said, I have this pass," and she showed them the pass that they were given for working in the clothing factory, and she was yelling at the police every day. She said, "You have no right to arrest my mother. This is the pass. This shows that she cannot be deported." And she pleaded with her every single day for weeks, and then Sarah's mother was released. So Paulette, her sister Paulette, had rescued her mother. It was very miraculous, yes. After that, they realized that everybody in the family had to go into hiding immediately. It was much too dangerous to be around. So Sarah and her younger sister went to a small town, Le Guédegno, and her two brothers found shelter on farms, and her younger sisters and baby brother Max were sheltered by a Christian family. And Sarah's going to read something about her life when she was living in this small town. She was hiding, and she was by herself at this point. Yeah.
I'm going to read a little piece from one chapter where I live in the village, and my little sister, Madeleine, was sent back by train back to Paris, and from Paris back to this Christian family who gave her shelter, because nobody could stay with my parents. They lived in a small room with another family in hiding in one room. Now, after my little sister left, I went to the only store in this village, and I asked to work for them. And naturally, they knew very well who I was by then, why I'm asking for shelter. And then they gave me a job, but they were afraid to keep me in their house for sleeping, so they find me a place outside of the village, deserted, in one room on the bottom, an old building, totally deserted. And I would read a piece of this place I was living for. I would leave work at 9 or 10 p.m. each evening. My new home was an abandoned building on the outskirts of town where I occupied an empty room on the first floor with no running water, toilet or electricity. Above me, an eccentric old man lived by himself. I worried about him coming into my room at night. To reach the dilapidated building, I had to find my way across the village at night with no street lights. Sometimes I stumbled in the dark and scraped my legs against sharp bushes. When I could not find my way back to the main street right away, I would sob quietly to myself. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I could make out the flickering of tiny fireflies that lit up bushes along the road. They became a comforting sight by my new silent companions in the darkness. I guess I did. No, I did. Thank you. On the floor in my room, I could hear the scratching noises of rats as they scurried around. It always sent shivers down my spine. I imagined them coming into my bed and running all over me. As I lay down, I pulled a blanket over my head to keep them out. Then my scalp would reach in a wood rabbit. During the night, I thought about my family so far away and wished I could see them. The daylight was a welcoming relief.
In the summer of 1943, Sarah got a letter from her mother saying, come back home right away, to come back home to Paris, without explaining anything. And she went back to Paris, and her mother said that her mother and Sarah's sister had contacted a Jewish resistance movement, an underground movement called the Cesium, the Sixth. And there was a young man. When Sarah arrived at her parents' apartment in Paris, there was a young man standing there. He was about 19 years old. And he greeted Sarah warmly, and he said, I have forged identification papers for you. You're going to change your name. You're going to be Catholic now. I found a hiding place for you. And Sarah went to live in Clermont-Ferrand in central France. She was given new identification papers, and she was given a safe house to live in, and this young man found a job for her in a hardware store. One problem was that she had to serve German customers in the hardware store, so she had to be very careful not to have any Yiddish accent at all. And Sarah was very fluent in French, so she was able to do that. But it got dangerous in 1944. This person from the resistance said, people know that there are some Jews hiding here. It's no longer safe for you. You've got to leave right away. Now, there are two choices for escaping. You could go into a convent. There were some convents that were hiding Jewish children. Or we could take you to the Swiss border. But it would be dangerous. You would have to climb a barbed wire fence. The Germans are patrolling it with dogs. It's going to be dangerous, but those are the two options. Which do you want to do? Did you say something more? We're almost finished, yes. So Sarah decided to go over the barbed wire fence. That was her choice. I will just read from the border crossing. We reached the border town without incident. The sun had barely risen, so the light was dim and the air was hazy. Everything seemed enveloped in an opaque cloud. Our new guide met us and silently and hurriedly escorted us to a house close to the Swiss border. We could see a field, and we could see that there was a high fence straight ahead. Our guide explained rapidly that German soldiers were patrolling the border with dogs, and that there were intervals of a few minutes between their rounds at this border spot. He told us to be very quiet and to try to ignore the barking of dogs, since there was nothing that we could do about this. He looked at our group of 12 children. 2 of them were younger and smaller, and they would need help getting across. You must climb over the barbed wire fence as quickly as possible, helping the 2 small children. You must not stop at any moment, even if you're cut by wire. Just jump over and run as fast as you can. You'll be safe on the other side. And then I looked around and saw that our leader had disappeared. The next few moments passed in a fog. I don't remember thinking or feeling. Call it survival instinct. Some special strength stored away for a moment when your life is at risk. We were alone facing the barbed wire fence. I saw the fearful eyes of a small girl next to me, standing motionless as if transfixed. I could hear dogs barking, their sounds getting closer. I lifted the little girl and helped her onto the fence. Then I began climbing behind her. I helped her over to the top and pushed her over the fence just before I jumped to the ground. Suddenly, we were all on the other side, lying dazed and speechless in the grass. I looked at my hands and legs, bloody from the barbs on the fence, but did not notice the pain. My clothes were torn and bloodied, and the little girl moved closer to me. We were safe at last. So, not over yet. It's not finished yet, but Sarah stayed in a Swiss refugee camp from 1944 until the war ended. And she received training to be a nurse. She worked as a nurse in a clinic for refugees. And after the war, her whole original family of 10 people were reunited in Paris in spring of 1945. Her brother-in-law, Jack, was the only one who had been killed. He had been deported to Auschwitz. Sarah worked as a secretary, and then she decided to do volunteer work with orphans of the Holocaust, and with an organization called the OSE, a Jewish welfare organization. She traveled to Israel with the orphans, and she lived in Israel for 7 years before returning to Paris. And then in 1948, in 1957, she moved to the United States. She emigrated to rejoin her family in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Yes, and now we're happy to take your questions.
This is amazing. Sarah, can you tell us how you met Joe? How did you meet your husband, Joe? Is that in the book?
Yes. I met him in New York City, in a ballroom. But no, we didn't dance together. I met him after I was ready to pick up my coat. And my girlfriend told me, look at this, a nice looking man looking at us. And I turned him around, and I saw his handsome face, and fate was there. Then he approached us, he introduced himself, and he took me home, and 6 months later, we were engaged. But he was also European, he was also from Poland. Okay? But another question?
What do you attribute your family's survival? Do you think there was a reason? What reason do you think your family was able to survive the war and the Holocaust.
Can you repeat the question?
Um,
Say it again, please.
what do you attribute your family's survival?
Yes?
That's the question.
Because I got a wonderful Jewish, courageous woman, mother, and I got two married sisters, and they worked, and there was an underground. There was even a Jewish underground. The Jewish underground is saved me, La Sixième. It's a group of wonderful, dedicated young men and women. They all of them belong to the Éclaireurs Français, Scouts, Jewish Scouts. In France, interesting, there was three kinds of Scouts: the Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant. They were separated, but they were very friendly. But they didn't gather together. And there was a Jewish Scouts, and it was a wonderful, dedicated group. A lot of them were sacrificed. The young man who saved me, he was from Alsace-Lorraine, from a wonderful Jewish family, and he was also religious, observant, and he was killed too, and many others.
I just wanted to add that there were many righteous Christians in France. There was one family that was hiding 3 members of Sarah's family, her kids, at risk to their own lives. They were hiding them. And actually about 3/4 of Jews survived the Holocaust in France. That was a lot more than in other countries.
There was many groups of underground Jewish organizations, OSE, Œuvre de Secours aux Enfants, and the OSE, and they were wonderful too. And they worked with also in my group together, and they saved thousands of children. But millions of them were killed, murdered. Voilà.
What happened to your parents after the war?
Oh, she didn't. She has a question.
What happened to your parents after the war? What did they end up doing?
Okay. So after the war, my father was a religious man, as I told you, and my mother. And after the war, all the Jewish institutions were destroyed. There was no Jewish school. I went to a wonderful Jewish French school, but Jewish, protected by the Jewish Hirsch family. And they were closed on Shabbat. They were closed on kosher meals. And it was a Jewish holidays. They were closed. And after the war, they were there were no more Jewish institutional of service for the young Jewish kids. So we had family in America, and they invited my family to join them. I couldn't come right away because it only took my parents, my 2 little sister and brother. I was too old to come with them. I needed another sponsor. But not easy to come to America after the war. And so they came because they wanted to give my brother, my little sister a Jewish education, because my parents were very religious. My father was a graduate rabbi from a famous yeshiva. So he was very educated Jew and religious. So here they got the Jewish education. Voilà.
Question for you because my husband is Swiss and he was in Switzerland the whole time of the war. The Swiss were not allowed to have anybody stay, and if you came from France you could not stay more than one night, stay in their homes. So when you climbed over the barbed wire, was somebody there to meet you, to take you to the Swiss refugee camp? Because
I didn't understand nothing.
Okay.
Yes, there were border police that picked them up after they crossed the barbed wire fence and brought them to a refugee camp. The refugee camp had barbed wires around it also, and they had to stay there for a while, yeah.
But this was the Swiss Jewish people who did that?
The Swiss border police.
By the way, on the pictures that you showed right here, the girl, it's me coming into Switzerland. They took a picture. They asked you all your life story. They didn't. Then we were in a camp, protective camp, so-called for them. They couldn't get out at least for 2 months, and we slept on the floor on the straw. It was not easy.
Now, who had these camps? The Jewish part? Who? The Swiss? Was the Swiss?
The Swiss management.
Sarah, I read your book yesterday, and it was just wonderful. And I want to know if anybody in your family plays the violin.
No, but I still miss it. I don't suffer no more like before, thanks to my writing. But it's there.
Last question.
You read my book?
Yes.
You read my book?
Last question.
Did you or did any member of your family feel motivated to volunteer to work for the French resistance? And what is your experience in Israel after the war, and why did you leave Israel?
First of all, about the French resistance, yes, there was the French resistance. As a matter of fact, my brother Jacques joined them, and after the war, I saw him in a military outfit. My brother Jacques, he joined the underground.
Any other questions?
Repeat the question.
Oh.
About Israel.
What was your experience living in Israel after the war, and why did you leave Israel? What was it like in Israel?
Why did you leave Israel?
Good question. Because I was a young woman all by myself, and my family in America, my parents were in America, my sister, my brother were in America, and I was very lonely, and it was time, and I didn't have no place in Israel. I didn't have a home, except I got a work, but I missed my family. I missed my parents. And she reminds me. And I served in the Israeli army 2 years.
Any other questions? All right, I'd like to thank you both for a wonderful afternoon. It's nice to have you back home where you belong.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.